conference of the 29th Conference of Parties, which was held at Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan. So I have titled it The Outcomes and the Takeaways. One is always tempted in uh, sometimes to detone the hype that surrounds talking about climate. So, exaggerated headlines, clickbait headlines as they are called. So sometimes I'm tempted to have a very simple title, but on the other hand, sometimes it is better perhaps to convey the sense of what happened in a more catchy title. So perhaps the subtitle or the alternate title to this talk should be Deconstructing the Hype. So we've heard a great deal about it and with a lot of hype, focusing particularly on finance and India's intervention in the closing stages of the closing plenary session of this conference. But I think it is very important about Baku, the COP29 in particular, to appreciate the background in which the COP happened. I think if I were to summarize COP29, it's very easy to summarize. You will see as I proceed in my lecture that is in fact a summary, a good summary, in fact, correct summary of COP29 is fairly simple to do. But it is the background and the process by which we reach these outcomes that are very important to us. And I think that's the spirit of this lecture. You will excuse me, I have a bit of a cough and a cold, so that will, please pardon. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we have today what you might call in more formal language of international relations or governance, etc., what you might call a global climate regime. A regime, the term is used when you have a set of principles. There is some kind of agreements, treaties. There are more elaborate rules, and there are sort of ways to implement these. This sum total of all that is surrounds the issue of climate on the in the global arena is what you would call a regime. So you can have regimes of different kinds, but we talk of the global climate regime. This is not something that appears overnight. It takes a process since 1992. There is more than 30 years. But we can fairly say that we have today what we call the global climate regime. This does not mean there is entire agreement on what is to be done. It does not mean there are not deep divisions within it. But willy-nilly, there is also arenas of agreement of what we are talking about and so on and so forth. So there is what is the framework of the global climate regime? We can spend an entire a day talking about all the aspects of the regime, which of course is not our intention. But what are some very basic principles on which the regime is founded? So one is the fact that the fundamental document of the global climate regime, its founding charter, if you wish, is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. Its basic principles, in fact, in a section of the UNFCCC, which is labeled the principles, is that the world would undertake climate action, or all signatories would undertake climate action on the basis of equity and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. The other part of it, conveniently forgotten, sometimes even quite a bit in our own discussions in India, is that it says very clearly that in developed countries should take the lead. Now, this is not simply a principle, because in the subsequent article, it is very clearly transformed, elaborated as a commitment by developed countries to do two things. One is to take the lead in mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation, as you all know, is all the activities associated with reducing emissions uh, to a point where, as the UNFCCC calls it, the climate system can be stabilized, and all the process by which this can happen is all of this in mitigation. Adaptation is the fact that since there will be some inevitable consequences of warming that has occurred, we must know how to deal with it. And the other thing developed countries must do is they must take the lead in the provision of the means of implementation. It's a means of implementation, is a standard phrase which is used. How would you implement the climate action? And that developed countries must provide the means of implementation to developing countries in terms of finance, what is commonly referred to as climate finance, technology transfer, and capacity building, because you simply cannot put a pile of money or simply provide technology. There are means, etc., by which countries must learn how to. Developing countries need assistance to varying extent in how to undertake this action. So, for developing countries, however, while there is a common responsibility to undertake climate action, which is mitigation and adaptation, however, it is also recognizes the importance of development. It also recognizes the UNFCCC that the developing countries are not primarily responsible for the problem, and sustainable development. So poverty eradication and sustainable development are overriding priorities for developing countries. So it recognizes this very clearly. However, so these are the basic principles, and I would encourage all of you, if you have not read it, and even if you have read it, to refresh your memory by going and looking through the full text of the UNFCCC. So if you Google for it, it's very easy to find. So it's a long story, however, that even as the regime has been built up, even this account I have given of the role of the UNFCCC is contested, typically most primarily by the United States. The EU not in the same way, whereas Australia, New Zealand, Australia in particular, tends to go with the United States, Canada, for instance, also. So there is this, even this account of the importance of the UNFCCC is sometimes challenged, and the way one talks about the principles, etc. So if you wish, that the story is that, even we can go, let's stay on the previous. Even the United States was the very first country, in fact, to one of the very first countries to ratify the UNFCCC, not just sign it, but to what you call ratification, an act, a legal act. In different countries do it differently. The legal act by which you say, yes, I adhere to the treaty. So this process, the United States did it. But very soon after, with the realization of the actual ramifications of implementing this, they have initiated under their leadership, all developed countries have initiated a long story of diluting these principles and commitments. These principles and commitments were necessary because otherwise developing countries would not have signed the UNFCCC at all. And in fact, India has played a very important role in the making of the UNFCCC. And this is accounted very well, recounted well in a book chapter by Chandrasekhar Dasgupta, who was a leading Indian Foreign Service official and diplomat who was very involved in the UNFCCC process. So there has been a long story of diluting these principles and commitments. So let us move to that story. And so the constant tension, if you wish, and this has a very long history. You see, it goes back to this idea of this famous 70s, late 70s, called the limits to growth, early 70s and later, limits to growth, where a document put out on behalf of a gathering known as the Club of Rome, which is basically the whole thrust of the argument, where the ideas of exhaustion of natural resources first came up, was that it's all very well for the developed countries to have become prosperous, but the real problem is if China and India become prosperous, and they particularly concentrate on China and India, China and India and the rest of the world become prosperous, then the demand for resources would be so much that the world would exhaust all these resources. So this is one sort of way of thinking which underlies the approach of the global north to global environmental issues. The other is the obsession with population. So if you look at the obsession with population, so constantly, and that was also part of the limits to growth. And so the more people they are on a planet, the more resources they will demand, and so on and so forth. And the discourse on this ranges from a crude application of biological principles to human society, ranges from that to outright racism. So these two, the limits to growth idea and the overpopulation of the world by the poor, the global south, are two ideas which are a constant undercurrent in the global north's global environmental outlook. So from the beginning, once you got China and India and the rest of the developing countries to agree to the UNFCCC, there has been a constant process of not implementing it until and unless you got all countries, all developing countries, to undertake equal sort of climate action as much as the developed countries. So this has been a constant game. There have been some slight intensification of this, which I will come to shortly. So this process began. So the Kyoto Protocol was again something they could not avoid. The Kyoto Protocol, building on the momentum of the UNFCCC, actually had top-down, as you say, top-down meaning that there is a global agreement of very specific emission reduction targets for the developed countries. So this is something which is signed and agreed and decided globally. It's not that people say we will do what I want, so it has to be negotiated and agreed. So the Kyoto Protocol had top-down targets for the developed countries. Whereas then, with great effort, this was signed. However, it was negotiated, of course, by Al Gore personally played an important role in negotiating it on behalf of the United States. And having got that target in, of course, the United States typically extracted the price, which is that they got the rest of the world, despite their reluctance, to agree that carbon trading will play an important role. So okay, they got part of what they wanted, that whatever are the means of reducing emissions, markets must play a dominant role in the means of reducing emissions. But, well, they didn't get the entire part of the story about equal burden on developing countries. But no sooner than Al Gore signed, so to speak, metaphorically, agreed to the Kyoto Protocol at the COP, he came back to the US and they were confronted with this infamous resolution of the US Senate, which was 98-2, where they voted that the United States will undertake no binding emission reduction commitments until equivalent emission reductions were there for China and India. So that was the end of that. The United States did not sign the Kyoto Protocol. The other developed countries were stuck with it because they can't be like the United States. But over time, they also started undermining the Kyoto Protocol. So the Kyoto Protocol, even as it came into existence, was undermined. And of course, that's an independent story. We need not get further into detail. So the whole attempt then began to put equivalent emission restrictions on all countries, developed and developing. That was one part of the story. But in the meantime, the other part of the story was the intensifying reluctance in the United States to do anything at all. So this was the other part of the story. This is not true of Europe and all developed countries. Australia and Canada, of course, are particularly notorious as having political, parties or political formations coming to power who don't want to do anything. But not everybody speaks in the same language. But the United States, Australia, Canada, I would say, are perhaps the leading elements of this kind of attitude. So these two have begun to characterize. One, their inaction, their unwillingness to do anything at all, which is still a very potent force in American politics, as we have seen with the election of Trump. And the other is equal burden on all. So the undermining started at Bali in 2007 at COP13, where there was a mandate to produce an agreement within 2 years for a long-term goal of emissions reductions, meaning a goal which will be applicable to all. But of course, you can argue at this stage it is still something one can go along with. Mitigation commitments by developed countries with quantified emission limitation and reduction targets. It was still on the agenda. But developing countries is not that they have to be assisted towards a sort of less emissions intensive growth path, and meaning, but that is what is meant by overriding priorities being poverty eradication and sustainable development, but that they must start producing national mitigation action plans. Okay. Then, of course, came 2 years in the attempt to do this, it proved very contentious. The developed countries, of course, went beyond very much this framework to say that long-term goal of emissions reduction meant a peaking year for emissions for all countries. And then, of course, they started saying that, this means all countries must declare a peaking year, etc. So it ended up with the famous confrontation in Copenhagen in 2009, where which was very importantly set a temperature target of 2 degrees centigrade warming, saying, however, at the end that 1.5 is also to be considered, encourage peaking of emission for all parties, developed countries to, however, implement their own emission reduction targets to which they will commit. So this was the beginning of the voluntary self-commitment approach. Developing countries were supposed to implement their national mitigation action plans. It was not very clear whether it was a target, but then, of course, there was pressure to make it into a target with the introduction of monitoring, reporting, and verification and biannual inventory reporting for developing countries as well. Earlier, developing countries had a more looser framework of communicating their climate action to the UNFCCC. For the first time after Rio 1992, developed countries 17 years later finally committed finance to developing countries, basically USD 100 billion annually by 2020. So then nobody was satisfied, especially the LDCs, island states, and at that time Africa joined them, but they were not happy with this. They egged on very much by the United States. So you had by COP17, and also many developing countries were very unhappy with the process by which the agreement at Copenhagen began, where this closed room meeting between the four large emerging economies, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and the United States. Even the Europeans were not in the room. These five countries sort of sketched the agreement, which they then gave to others. So a lot of people were unhappy. And they all gathered together and saying, this agreement is not enough. And the target was very much, again, the large developing countries, where so at Durban, they finally produced an agreement, which was an agreement to evolve an agreement with legally binding commitment for all by 2050. Till then, India had always said that you can't have an agreement to have an agreement unless you decide what the agreement has to contain. So content before process. But here process dominated. So there was an agreement to have an agreement. Dilution of the developing divide. In fact, in the Durban platform, which is the name of that decision, there was no reference at all to developed and developing countries or to equity and CBDRRC. So to India's credit, though at that time India looked very isolated, we protested vehemently against this kind of agreement. But in the end, we had to also agree because of the general pressure. So, however, it also said that a temperature target of 2 or 1.5 degrees centigrade, no more than that, increase above pre-industrial levels is acceptable. So this agreement to have an agreement resulted in what we know as the Paris Agreement. It's quite interesting that the Paris Agreement seems like something that happened recently, but next year we will celebrate the 10th year of the Paris since the Paris Agreement was signed. So the since the 10th year since its signature. So the Paris Agreement had a definite principle of a temperature target of 2 degrees centigrade, staying well below 2 degrees is the language, but striving to keep limit the increase to 1.5. It famously also said that the world must reach, it doesn't use the word net zero, it says balancing emissions and removals and sinks to by in the second part of the century is the language, uh, modifying the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in the light of different national circumstances. So they added this, and this is, of course, the name of the game is to create confusion, which they have succeeded because many people think different national circumstances is the same as common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. It is not. I can explain that in detail later, maybe. So, but also different national circumstances is their means of saying that there are differences between developing countries. So you cannot treat them as a block. The mitigation commitments were finally established by countries through so-called nationally determined contribution. So we have come very far from targets to contribution, reaffirming by developed countries the commitment to provide USD 100 billion annually, but now 2020 extended to 2025. And by 2025 to decide on a new quantified collective goal for climate finance from this floor. Now, of course, you see in this story, everything has become voluntary. It was because of the United States. So even though Durban Agreement said that you need an agreement with legally binding commitments for all, Paris Agreement ended up with legally binding agreements for none. So, this was the Paris Agreement. Shall we say, it is inability to meet its target is built into its architecture. I am certainly going to make it very clear that people like myself, some others, very limited, I must say, the global applause for Paris Agreement was deafening. But nevertheless, there were a few counter squeaks, if you may say, here and there, counter noises. One of these was from my colleague Ujjal Kanitkar and myself from India. So we said it's a disaster waiting to happen because you are making this agreement, but you are doing nothing to actually slow down emissions, and there is not at all clear how you will do it. There are no targets. There are no targets distributed on the basis of equity. People are to volunteer to reduce emissions, and that's not going to happen. So, regrettably, I must say that a lot of this is clearly coming true today. And that is the background in which we are headed towards Baku. So all this rhetoric is presented by the developed countries with a lot of drum beating, with a lot of media hype, and I must say with the complicity of a significant section of global northern media and academics. Okay, academics are also very complicit in this story and saying that, we are making progress, this is happening. But what is happening to emission? In fact, if you look at the emissions of the developed countries, excluding the former Soviet bloc, 1992, of course, was the beginning of the implosion of the Soviet system across Russia and Eastern Europe, the industrial compression, the contraction which occurred over this period also led to reduction in emissions. But that is like, a bit like curing the headache by cutting off the head. So if you leave these countries out and look at only uh, the developed countries, excluding that lot, you see actually their overall emission from 1990 rose consistently till about 2007. And only then it has declined. And of course, 2019 is a good year to compare. 2020, 21, COVID, etc., creates problems in comparison. So even by 2022, if you look at more recent data, you will find that their reduction below 1990 is purely marginal. Okay, it's a few percent. It depends how you calculate it, but it is nowhere near what it is that they have done. And this graph speaks for itself. You can see that despite all the brave talk, each of these agreements produces actually in practice very little emissions reduction from those who are hugely responsible. Who is responsible? And here we must remember the story of what is called what a lot of people are familiar with now. It is called the global carbon budget. So it is not when peaking occurs, not what is the rate of increase in emissions or the rate of decline, but the total cumulative emissions. That is the determining factor, basically, with some details which I will not get into. That cumulative emissions of carbon dioxide in particular are the determining factor for global warming. Okay. Now, who is responsible for these cumulative emissions? So you look at the top of this graph, you see China, followed by India, followed by Africa, and that is roughly 17 to 18% each of these of the global population. So we are already talking here about something between 50 to 50. You can add South Asia, etc., into it. So we are actually talking here in the top about of something like 55 to 60% of the global population. It is the rest of it, including North America, excluding USA, that's basically Canada, maybe Mexico, depends how they count. Then the United States, the European Union, and of course the last is Europe, excluding the European Union. Look at the extent of their cumulative emissions. So these are the people who are responsible, and you see that their emissions are rising. Carbon dioxide, if your emissions are rising, the rate of growth slowing down is not enough. If you continue to contribute carbon, you continue to contribute emissions. So their contribution to emissions is really overwhelming. So then, of course, there was finally the Paris Agreement rule book was signed with a lot of combined arm twisting by the European and the United States, and it's very interesting. People often forget that the entire period from 15 to 20, the bulk of it was the Trump administration. So, just as we were going to celebrate the first year after Paris and Marrakech, just before the COP, Trump was declared elected, and the Trump administration was in power, was in office till 2021. 2020 was the elections it happened. That year, there was no COP because of COVID. But the United States, nevertheless, in all the negotiating rooms, despite the fact that it had said it is leaving the Paris Agreement, nevertheless negotiated alongside the European Union in putting all kinds of restrictions, etc., uh, all kinds of restrictions on the developing country. So this is something we should not forget. So at COP21, you saw this full thing, with the grandstanding by the developed country. Developed countries started stopping talk about 2 degrees warming target. They said, no, 1.5 is everything. And this is really ironical because they are doing nothing to slow down the approach to 1.5. But they are nevertheless increasing the rhetoric on keeping to 1.5. I mean, so this is really, the irony is quite spectacular here. They started this demand for net zero commitments from all, picking up momentum from the pre-2020 period, saying everybody has to give a net zero commitment. Their net zero, then of course there is the question of who has to give a net zero commitment when. And that depends on a number of factors, but the most prominent thing is how is the global carbon budget equitably shared between different countries. This, of course, is something they will not talk about. So they constantly talk of a declining carbon budget, even the US, etc., even though when the declining carbon budget was raised by developed countries prior to Paris, they would not want to talk about it. But with the declining carbon budget, they would talk about it, but with no concern for the fact that they have grabbed an inequitable share of the global carbon budget and are continuing to do so. Then, of course, imposing global targets for emissions reduction based on scientific literature which ignores climate justice, need for energy access and equity, and guarantee of food security. It's a shocking fact, but true, that the quantitative exercises which the IPCC has carried out in the 5th and 6th assessment report, where they have produced targets for emissions reduction globally, are all built on models that ignore all these three things: climate justice, energy access and equity, and food security. And it is only now, due to a vigorous debate stirred up by some developing countries, and India is in the lead in this, that this has come on the agenda of the IPCC. So, this idea somehow that scientists have a sort of, shall we say, are the ultimate prophets, if you wish, or all ultimate gurus of what climate action should be, is completely incorrect. Global northern scientists have been very complicit in this kind of very inequitable scenarios of the future. Then, of course, overall, there is this whole rhetoric of urgency and crisis, but no commitments are forthcoming. So even today, yesterday, the United States announced this new NDC, which is pathetic, because they say they will reduce emissions 60% below, 61% below 2005 levels by 2035, which is highly inadequate. This is maybe what the IPCC has said that everybody should do, but obviously, if the whole world as a whole has to do this, the United States should be doing far more. Okay? So even their own civil society is criticizing them for it. But there is this whole, therefore, this rhetoric of urgency and crisis, but with no new commitments. And that's the amazing thing. Okay? Unfortunately, I must say there are sections of the Indian media which simply echo this, and sections of even environmental movements without seeing that this is exercise which is bound to fail, and Baku was where this has started coming apart. So before we got to Baku, there was Dubai. So one of the factors of this Paris Agreement, in this whole narrative of the Paris Agreement about how the world to do emissions reduction, was that yes, we'll all have voluntary contributions. But once we have voluntary contributions, then how do we know whether we are on track? So every 5 years, we will review what is the state of emissions reduction globally. And this review is called the global stocktake. And once we have done this review, then everybody must submit a new round of NDCs with more and more ambition. In fact, they say highest possible ambition, so that you can undertake more emissions reduction. Now, of course, how are we going to do this? And especially developing countries which have poverty eradication to take off, which have building infrastructure to take off, which have a whole lot of development deficits to take off, and which have to do this battling adverse global political and economic environment. After all this, you are also supposed to be ambitious in climate reduction. So obviously it won't happen, and it has not happened. So, but the global stocktake was an occasion for a lot of pressure, lot of grandstanding, and grandstanding not only by developed countries, but by a peculiar set of partners that they have. And this really makes me view the exercise at the International Court of Justice as quite hypocritical. Maybe in the question and answer, we can talk briefly about that. So basically, at Dubai, you had a new set of global targets. Quantitatively, the most important that by 2030, renewable energy would be tripled above 2022 levels, doubling the global annual rate of increase of energy efficiency improvements to targets, along with 7 more qualitative targets like withdrawing, transitioning from fossil fuel, reducing, phasing out of unabated coal power, and so on and so forth. It also noted the global target of GHG emissions reduction of 43% by 2030 and 60% by 2035 relative to 2019, and reaching net zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. But the thing, of course, which it does not say, and you cannot say it because the developed countries will not allow talk of it, is that who is to do what share? So is this tripling of renewable energy going to come from the increased demand for energy in the developing countries, or is it going to come also primarily or to the extent, to a major extent, from the replacement of the oil and gas infrastructure of the developed countries by renewable energy? Where is it going to come from? So there is no talk of that. And last but not least, you had this whole idea in the global stocktake that which developed countries really pushed into the document, saying there must be a follow-up to GST. So developing countries, especially the big developing countries, said that the Paris Agreement says that the global stocktake, the review will inform parties. After that, it is voluntary. But now suddenly, they no longer want it voluntary. So that is one important part of the Baku background. The other thing, however, the developing countries managed to get out of the global stocktake document, final agreement, which of course was inevitable because you can't hide this fact, that finance is necessary to achieve all these targets. So for the needs of developing countries for meeting NDCs, if you look at all the nationally determined contribution statements by developing countries, add up their need for finance, which can be stated there. It adds to 5.8 to 5.9 trillion for the period up to 2030. Adaptation finance needs are 215 to 387 billion annually up till 2030. This was in the UNEP gap report. Clean energy needs, as estimated by the International Energy Agency, which is an OECD agency and not a UN agency, is 4.3 trillion USD per year up to 2030 and 5 trillion per year up to 2050. All this when even the 100 billion has not been reached, which was promised at Copenhagen. Then the current flows, the OECD claims it has reached 89.6 billion. But if you look at all the money which is coming, not as convert loans into what is called concessional or grant equivalent, the actual number comes up to only 30 billion. So for India gets money, but India gets money from the Green Climate Fund, and then you find that we have to provide co-financing in terms of in cash or kind and so on and so forth. So none of the efforts which India has undertaken, for instance, and it's true of most developing countries, and certainly true of China, Saudi Arabia, etc., all our efforts at mitigation are funded by ourselves, essentially. Currently, the GCF pledge does not even amount to, only amount to 12.3 billion. So this is the background in which we got to Baku. So now you would realize why I said that Baku is very simple to understand. So what did we get at Baku? So the developed countries were very clear. Simple storyline. No finance to give. Be realistic. No money. No certainly concessional finance. No certainly finance from public sources. Nothing. What are we going to do? What is the argument? The argument is a lot of money available in the world. What it is, the problem is that you are not creating, you meaning developing countries, are not creating the wherewithal for this money to flow to you. It is waiting to come to you, but your governance is poor. You don't have the enabling conditions. You cannot write proposals. That's basically what they are saying. Project proposals. You cannot de-risk for the coming of private finance, meaning you have to provide them various guarantees that they will get their returns on their investment. So you have to do what is necessary to attract private finance. We don't have anything to give. If at all we can give, it is money which will be like seed money to pave the way for private finance to flow. This is their basic attitude. So then, of course, there is a hue and cry, but they refused to budge. So they hung around 200, went up to 250. Then they said China and all other developing countries which can afford to do so must contribute. They do it in sort of subtle ways by playing around with the language of the agreement. But of course, countries like China and certainly India are saying our responsibility is not commensurate with that kind of provision of finance which the world requires. And as you saw from the cumulative emission graph, it is very clear where the emissions responsibility is, and it is where the emissions responsibility lies is also where the wealth of the world is concentrated. And especially if you look at wealth, then the extent of domination of the global north is strikingly clear when if you look at wealth and assets. So this is one part of the story. The other part, however, the developed countries have this extraordinary argument that every year we are going to review the entire performance of the Paris Agreement. Now, this is really extraordinary because, to a lay person or to people outside the framework of this kind of issues, it is not very clear. If every year you are reviewing performance, there are developing country governments will be kept simply busy answering global queries, multilateral institutional queries. And in fact, there is no focus on the provision or the means of implementation, but implementation has to be agreed to. So every year, implementation of mitigation targets must be discussed. And in fact, there were two sort of quote-unquote dialogues, as they are called, which were envisaged, and every dialogue, one dialogue which is called the UAE dialogue and GST outcomes, must be like a mini GST every year. Review everything from the beginning. So you spend all your time reviewing without really figuring out what it is that you are doing, and even without giving any time to do anything. So basically reducing the place to a talk shop. The second thing is, and this they were very clear, that the NDCs cannot be voluntary. He had told them this, it is not they who warned about it. It is developing countries which had said that there must be binding targets based on equity and CBDRRC. So now they come saying, no, we need to have some kind of top-down elements in the structure of the Paris Agreement, but we will not talk about equity and differentiation. So obviously, nobody is going to buy this. So in fact, at various times, developing countries, particularly India, made it very clear that yes, you want to talk about top-down agreements, we are not scared. We can talk about responsibility, who contributed how much to the current state of affairs. But however, that's a separate agreement. That is not the Paris Agreement. You wanted voluntary contributions, you will get voluntary contribution. So you want to change the system? Let's talk about it based on equity, but you cannot substitute one for the other. This was basically the story of Baku. So with a little more, couple of more details, and I'll wrap up. So the developed countries, these now negotiations go on. They went on and on. So in this UAE dialogue, there was 10 days of, the final discussion on the modalities of the dialogue. There was a complete standoff. So developed countries finally strong-armed the presidency because, the EU goes to the COP president, which is the senior minister from Azerbaijan, and say, we'll walk out if you don't do anything. I'm not saying that they did, but, the kind of pressures which are possible. So they started inserting new elements into the agreement, into the decision, things which developing countries didn't want. And of course, eventually the developing countries said, okay, we can even take some of this, but no new monitoring, reviewing, and reporting will be required. As it is, every 2 years, we have to submit reports on the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So why would you want to every year create a pressure? So this led to a stalemate. There was no decision. Similarly, there is a dialogue which are supposed to be held, sharing experiences on how NDCs are being prepared, but the developed countries said this must be an annual exercise. Developing countries said once the NDCs are submitted next year, why would you want to continue with this exercise? So that was a stalemate, and everywhere in other sort of discussions, etc., which are ongoing in the UNFCCC, they wanted to bring the GSP process, the outcome, so to speak, into part of the process, which was refused by developing countries. So this was, of course, the big stalemate. So there were very quickly, I'll talk about two forward sort of positive things. One is on adaptation. Progress is being made, but of course, the big thing about adaptation is even though developing countries want to put it on the agenda, etc., monitoring adaptation globally is of no use if there is no adaptation support in the form of finance, technology, and capacity building which is available. So the constant attempt of developed countries is to sneak mitigation in through the back door. Unfortunately, across the world, they succeed by taking the term climate resilience and distorting its meaning. So you'll find in many parts of the world, and regrettably, Kerala also, I am sorry to say, offers an example. You talk of adaptation, and it is full of elements which are mitigation. So the process by which this occurs is something that needs to be discussed, I think, in a more transparent and open manner. But if you have an adaptation mission in a developing country like India, and you say carbon trading and electric vehicles are part of it, then I think one is making a fundamental mistake. Nevertheless, this is the global agenda. So people have this crude idea that if I want to avoid impacts in Kerala, I must stop reducing emissions in Kerala. I mean, Kerala's footprint, I'm sorry to say, we are not even culprits in emissions. So, you know, if we are so, shall we say, our level of material wealth production is so low that we are not even the culprits of global warming. So in this scenario, to think that our emissions reduction have a determining influence in some way on our adaptation is fundamentally erroneous. But the developed countries have this new agenda, and I must say, this is something that we need to investigate much more carefully. This whole idea that of transformational change. Climate change, they call it transformational adaptation. Shockingly, the IPBES, which is the intergovernmental science policy platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services, IPBES, which is the IPCC equivalent for biodiversity, has produced an entire report called Transformative Change Assessment, which is full of this stuff. And this is really, in my view, adding insult to injury. The global north academics calling on developing countries to transform their society, economies, and even values and worldview. For heaven's sake, you know. So this is something they tried very hard to push. Developing countries very successfully said nothing of the sort. We will not agree to this. So there is some, otherwise some progress is being made on adaptation, and this is of importance to us. And then, of course, the tamasha over carbon trading. So basically, the framework for carbon trading is in place, but it is still basically, there's a huge amount of detail. It is not, however, comparable to the Kyoto Protocol in any sense. So the clean development mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol allowed developing countries to undertake emissions reduction and be compensated for it without affecting their mitigation commitments. But here, what we do not realize, which is very important, is if there is any carbon trading, okay, then whatever carbon you carbon emissions whose value reduction, whose value you sell and you are compensated for, this will be taken out of your targets. So if you are compensated for some emissions reduction, you cannot also claim it as part of your emissions reduction. It will become emissions reduction on the part of the person who paid you for it. So it becomes his property, his contribution. So every time, so you might open India's carbon market for private entities to undertake emissions reduction and get carbon credits and be compensated for it. But they may make a profit, but we must be careful that this does not mean that India's emission reduction burden will increase. So it cannot be. So India's carbon market is still not opened up for Article 6 trading, as it is called. So private profit should not become the nation's loss. Also, there is this very mistaken rhetoric that Article 6 is climate finance. In Government of India, for its part, is very clear that carbon markets and Article 6 trading, carbon credits are not climate finance. And in fact, India overall and developing countries, the global south overall, are net creditors of carbon. It is the developed countries who owe us carbon debt. And in this process, without an equitable allocation of mitigation commitments, and with the current system of NDCs, Article 6 does not benefit carbon creditor countries overall. So whether under particular circumstances we should allow it or not is something we need to discuss. But certainly allowing it in agriculture is, in my view, a very erroneous path to take for the future. So with these words, I'll stop here. I've gone on a little, somewhat over time, but I am thankful for the opportunity to present. Let me, that is quickly, I'm sorry, there's just one more slide. I spoke too quickly. Next slide. So what is the story? So unfortunately is not good news. At COP30, we will meet in a radically different geopolitical setting as far as climate is concerned because of Mr. Trump, and that is quite serious. The EU and other developed countries will push for greater commitments from us, from developing countries, without much clarity on their targets. This cannot be acceptable. And this idea that China and India somehow should compensate for this is, I hate to say it, but in my view, ridiculous. And certainly it is not applicable to India. So I think the 1.5 target is out of reach. I think limiting global warming to 1.5 is not possible for a number of reasons. 1.7, 1.75, 1.8, this range, I believe, based on some numbers, is potentially feasible, but of course requires consistent effort. But certainly, as Brazil is saying, based on 1.5 at COP30, we should not accept any target because 1.5 is not going to happen. The most important thing, I think, is the developmental agenda. In India, we should not ignore development. Instead of wasting time talking about decarbonizing the health sector, this is the new fashion which is going around. We should focus on improving our health, our agriculture, our all our social developmental aspects, the provision of food, clothing, shelter, and guaranteeing for all at an adequate level has never been more important. If this is the slogan of Viksit Bharat 2047, I am certainly all for it. But we cannot have a situation, where you end up, what shall we say, talking about net zero in mitigation and not talking about zero hunger, zero malnutrition, or zero of all the economic problems that we face. It is very important that we distinguish ourselves from this hyped up talk of green development as opportunity. Nothing comes for free, whether it is green, blue, red, orange, or violet. Development requires financial, technological resources. There is nothing that comes for free. Equally, alarmism on adaptation is misplaced. It is 1.5 if we cross, it is not going to be pralaya. I think we need to have a sober view of the relationship between development and adaptation. And I think we need far more thinking and intellectual effort in this direction. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. And we have some time for a very brief discussion. There are a couple of questions in the comment box, if you could look at it.
There's one, it said global effort to mitigate everything. Time is running out. The third one, Tuesday morning, this is what is the practice. See, I think the UN Secretary General, unfortunately, and I'll say this very clearly because once at a meeting, I had an opportunity to tell him myself. So it's not secret. See, calling the GST report telling us that we are on global boiling and not global warming, that kind of language is not helpful. Have we had a lot of events, extreme events, which have disastrous consequences? Yes. How much of it is avoidable? How much of it is bad planning? And how much of it is greater exposure, as they say, because you build more, your economy develop, etc. And how much is really the impact of greater warming is something which we have stopped looking at carefully. So we keep saying, if it rains too much and my street floods, which it does anything more than 1 centimeter of rain, then everybody it is climate global warming. As it can't work like that. We can't look at it in this fashion. So I think what is the scope for adaptation? I think we are really not fully aware. We need to invest much greater effort in this. I believe there is considerable scope. If, for instance, in Africa, the contribution of technology to agriculture growth in agriculture production is actually declining. Africa is suffering from lack of technology in its agriculture, and is primary factor for the productivity levels of African agriculture is simply not climate. But everybody talks only of climate. So I think this is very problematic. So there is, I think, no room for alarmism. The UN says, please don't use that word UN says, it is quite incorrect. The UN is not a super government. The UN is as good as the people who control the way the UN works, which is a lot of influence there of the developed countries. So we need to look at this soberly. Yes, we have to take more action. But no, we are not at the edge of a precipice. Baku agreement is the worst agreement. Really, I am not a fan of extreme language because it takes away from a proper analysis. Kyoto is gone, and Kyoto was not great, frankly, if you ask me, because some level of what will be the commitment of developing countries was missing in Kyoto, and that certainly was a problem. It had differentiation, which was important. So, in fact, my whole entry into the study of climate change began with saying that yes, Kyoto is not working, but Kyoto cannot be the answer to the world in the medium to long term. And so countries like India need to do their share. And I believe that the policy of India in the long term is laid out in two documents which people should have a look at. Number one is the India's submission to the UNFCCC on India's long-term strategy for long-term low emissions development strategy, LTLEDS. It is called. It is available on the UNFCCC website. The other very important document, which I would encourage people to read, and which is India's submission and the International Court of Justice. I think it is a good document. I think it is well argued. India's viewpoint on equitable sharing of the global atmospheric commons is well laid out there. It is not understood by the other countries. And especially, I was saying, the hypocrisy of the ICJ process. It is really, if you look at the ICJ debate and the way it is being presented, it is as if it is David versus the Goliaths. So the David of the world are these small island states, and the Goliath is the big developed countries, and sometimes they add us also to the list. But at the same time, it is actually, if you have been following negotiations, you realize it is actually the small island states and sometimes even the LDCs, etc., we become the partners of the rich countries, the developed countries, contrary to, in opposition to the rest of the developing countries. So this is very problematic and very hypocritical. This is, in fact, the real danger of the ICJ judgment is not that it will not rule in favor of island states, but is actually it will produce a ruling which ignores responsibility, equity, etc., and simply based on a narrow and incorrect analogy with transboundary pollution, will say that everybody has to cut emissions right away. So I think that unfortunately, without taking care of important issues related to development or foregrounding the right to development alongside other rights in the discussion. So let us see how that goes. The responsibility. No, I would, however, very much disagree saying that mitigation and adaptation has become the responsibility of all. You see, that is, I am sorry to say, that is just imagining your capacity. India's cumulative emissions contribution is about 3%. So our emissions reduction, I am sorry to say, does not matter. So saying responsibility of all is actually to perpetuate our lack of energy use, ignore the lack of adequate energy to the bulk of our population, and is a recipe for keeping the poor poor in this country. Let me be very frank about it. And this responsibility of mitigation, adaptation has become the responsibility of the all, ignores the fact. And our friend who has written is willfully ignoring it, saying irrespective of who is responsible. I think this spirit of sacrifice is welcome, but unfortunately is of little practical or any value as a policy. So I would firmly disagree with the friend who has put this. Well, let me turn to the last one. The other one was a comment from Mr. Vijayan. Net zero emissions by 2015. See, and that is one of the things that we do not realize in this game, or in fact is willfully sort of disappears from the debate, is that there are things we do not know the answer to. And when we do not know the answer, they must be accepted upfront. And that would help us find answers. But if you do not accept that there is a problem, then you are not going to solve it. So I think instead of this debate about net zero, realistic or unrealistic, you have to have a full emphasis, okay? And a directed sort of effort from across the world, but a directed access which does not depend on equity will fail. So this is like saying India is a shortfall in its deficit. What in its fiscal deficit? Oh, let us take Kerala for instance. Kerala has a fiscal deficit. It is very difficult to bridge the fiscal deficit, get financial resources for Kerala's development. So what do? You decide that you will tax income equally for that tax income over and above what you are doing now. Of course, the state cannot tax income, but impose whatever. Suppose, imagine for argument's sake that it can tax income. So you not only you start taxing income equally on all. So will it work? It won't work. It won't work because the bulk of the population who don't have much income have nothing to provide. This is the same story globally. If you insist on emission reduction by all, it's like the US is saying 60% by 2035, 60% emission reduction by all. If India reduces its emission from what it is today, 60% by 2035, I assure you, you cannot even do it. It will be just empty talk. And if you actually insist on doing it, you will just perpetuate or in fact intensify energy poverty across the country, or simply make the provision of electricity and energy, the cost of electricity and energy impossibly high. In fact, already for the renewable energy priorities which we have in our grid, electricity grid in the southern states, we are paying 1,500 crores more than because of these priority to renewable energy than we would have done otherwise. So even our current renewable energy use comes at a considerable cost, which is paid for by consumers. And eventually it becomes part of the costs of further economic development. So I think need is very important to take this into account. See, from the private players, yes, tap fund from manufacturing industry. Unfortunately, currently what is happening is that the private industry is very enthusiastic about emissions reduction where in agriculture. So we have all this talk about reducing emissions in India's food system, and nobody asked what is the relative contribution of food reduction by emission reduction by farmers versus emission reduction by the tractor companies. Why can't they produce more efficient tractors? Why are we insisting on farmers buying solar pump sets? Why aren't we paying attention to the fuel efficiency of India's tractors? That's in fact, you hear almost nothing about the fuel efficiency of India's mechanical farm equipment, whereas you hear so much about pump set, solar pump set. So these are the issues I think we need to be looked into carefully. I do not believe that we can solve this problem by going to the courts. I think in general, you cannot legislate development. And this is a very problematic view. Nowadays, everybody thinks human rights is everything. I know, for instance, our life expectancy in India is what it is. In a country like Japan, it is at least 10 years higher. So what should I say? Should I say that I have a legal right to the same level of same life expectancy as in Japan? Does that constitute a fundamental right? But you can turn the argument around. Why do you think you can live only up to 75? Can't I live up to 85? So, turning this into a legal question does not help. And that's the challenge of development. And the sooner we understand it would be the better, especially in terms of how to handle issues of development. So I think I've sort of answered all the questions. I think we are also running out of time. About Kerala, I would say very briefly, I think Kerala, its first attempts are at a climate action plan are good. It shows the enthusiasm in the state for climate action, which is a very positive thing. But I think it needs, first of all, to be far more scientific. I think it needs to be far more clear. I think it needs to stop confusing mitigation with adaptation. Stop this sense of hubris in somehow that we are a developed country, we are also going to do electric vehicles, stuff like that. I think much greater challenges lie in adaptation, even in Kerala. For India as a whole, certainly. And I think we need to pay attention to this in a very clear, in a very systematic way. So I think I don't mean a version 2.0 of documents, but a sort of version 2.0 in our attitude to what is climate action in Kerala is required. Yeah, of course, those who want to purchase electric vehicles can do so. Should government insist that all its vehicle purchases should be electric vehicles? I'm not a fan of that. There are many issues like that in concrete detail which have to be studied, but that is a issue, which has to be carried out in Kerala, and outsiders to the debate like me can only comment, but it is something that has to emerge from the polity and society.
Hey, I am George Thomas, former chairman, Kerala State Biodiversity Board. I know you.
Yes, of course, we have met before.
Yeah, we met. So,
yeah, go ahead.
What Nadasha is saying is, so for many previously, based on our greenhouse gas inventory made by Kerala. So if you consider agriculture alone, of course, agriculture alone, about 47% carbon sequestration is there. Affordable. Agriculture, forestry, and land use. If you consider affordable together, there is 47% carbon sequestration is there. And I stress that, or I try to convince that out of this, around 25% sequestration is from agriculture sector. That means our agriculture in Kerala, if you consider that agriculture alone, that is carbon neutral, or rather carbon negative. That is what she was trying to say. Anyway,
yes, please go ahead.
Anyway, I was listening to your talk very keenly, and you almost covered almost all the aspects, especially with this mitigation and adaptation. And people have a misunderstanding that we should give more importance to mitigation. Anyway, I am with you. I always stress that we should give more importance to adaptation rather than mitigation, especially if you consider the developmental aspirations of the people and the kind of food security and other kind of things. And you are also stressing as a member of the planning board on this aspect. I observed this point many times. And with respect to this agriculture, and government, I don't know, government has a campaign for carbon neutral agriculture. Probably that may be the reason why Natasha stressed that point or pointed out that point. So what is your take on that? And now you also mentioned about Article 6. This carbon neutral, then green credit, carbon credit, green credit, then voluntary carbon market, regulated carbon market. And last year, government pronounced this Indian carbon market also. And they were waiting for the Article 6 to unfurl. Now what happens is, the government, I don't know why they are not taking any action at all. And there are some people, they try to cash on that if you enlist and give some money, so we will provide you carbon credit, and it is very easy. There are some people who are doing this kind of business. So there is no clarity on this carbon credit, especially after the elect or after approving this Article 6. And better than me about this gold standard, Verra, and their operations. So what will be their fate if Article 6 is going to be implemented?
Just very briefly, Dr. Thomas, I think we have been, as you say, this this greenhouse gas inventory for Kerala, this is an issue which has to be dealt with carefully. Now, if you will see the IPCC, in the particularly where you have a reporting of emissions, people are very cagey about subnational inventory. Why? Because your interdependence on other parts of the country are tremendous. So how much steel does Kerala produce? Nothing. How much aluminium do we produce? Nothing. How much any of the metals we produce? Nothing. How much of the ingredient for plastic we produce? Nothing. Well, a good percentage of our electricity we import. So then are we saying eventually by doing a local inventory of what you emit from here only, are we saying we are good and Jharkhand is bad because they have the coal which powers us, they have the iron ore which is necessary for steel. Jamshedpur is responsible for India's emissions, whereas Kochi is pure and clean. This argument does not work. Whereas if you take national economies, accounting for trade and international distribution of goods and services leading to emissions, there is some hope of keeping track. In India, we cannot do it. And in fact, economists know this in the fact that India does not produce even for a single state. We do not produce an input-output table. There have been some attempts, but not very successful. Even for our country itself, we are lagging in updating our input-output tables, which is an essentially econometric ingredient if you want to do this kind of inventory accounting. So unfortunately, the Kerala State Action Plan has talks of an inventory for Kerala that I would technically consider must be taken with a pinch of a block of salt, if you ask me. However, having said this, what Dr. Thomas is saying about agriculture is correct, because agriculture is local activity. So apart from the electricity aspect, the fertilizer use, the other way agricultural practices are there, especially in paddy cultivation, etc. The kind of emissions that is required can be studied. And what often is ignored in this aspect is that the carbon sequestration, which is there in wetlands, particularly, which is much higher than the others. And in Kerala, of course, they are associated with not natural wetlands, but wetlands associated with paddy cultivation, etc. All of this must be considered in the carbon balance. But typically, when people talk of agriculture emissions, the sequestration of carbon in cropland is assigned under some different head. So for Kerala, I'm not aware. I'm sure Dr. Thomas has looked at it more carefully. But if you ask me, I would actually be interested. It is some exercise that I am carrying out with my colleagues, ongoing research. We would be interested in looking at sequestration in the soil, in agricultural soils due to agriculture of carbon. So that will give us a better picture. And as for the, it is in this context, you see, food security is important. And if you do not have food security, then mitigation without food security is a complete non-starter for our country. And I think, unfortunately, in all our mitigation discussion, we have not foregrounded the question of food security. Globally, the sixth assessment report of the IPCC is a disaster on food security. The more mitigation you do, the way they think about mitigation, the way they project it, the more mitigation you do, the more you endanger food security. And 1.5 food security is endangered even more than in 2 degree centigrade mitigation. Unfortunately, this has never came out in the executive summary, the summary for policy makers of the IPCC reports. My colleagues and I have been working on this, and we are among those, alongside some Japanese scholars, who have now started pointing this out. And the IPCC now acknowledges that its projections for future emissions reduction do not account for food security. This is a fact. So I think our agriculture discussion needs to be much more powerfully oriented towards food production, food security, and I must say, frankly, over enthusiasm in Kerala's context about carbon neutral agriculture is possible because your bulk of the food requirements of Kerala come from outside. This is a fact. And indeed, perhaps, and this I say in part humorous, part serious fashion, the prosperity of contemporary Kerala comes from fossil fuels, not fossil fuels here, but fossil fuels in West Asia. It is the fossil fueled growth of West Asia that contributes 30% of Kerala's GDP or whatever. Others here on the call can be more precise. So I think we need a more, less emotional, more less moralizing, not emotional. It can be emotional, less moralizing discussion and a more analytical discussion of what we need to do in Kerala's agriculture and in Kerala as a whole, looking forward to the future. Yes.
So thank you very much, Professor Jayaraman, for a very insightful talk. And we would like to thank each one of you for attending LUCA Climate Talk. And I would like to remind you all of you that we have also published a number of articles on this, on climate change and climate policy and related subjects. So thanks again and good night.
Thank you. Thank you all for the opportunity and for your patience. Thank you. Bye-bye.